I was proud to be with the President today when he signed into law the Financial and Wall Street Reform Bill. This is the legislation that I've probably worked more on in my first 18 months as United States Senator than any other piece of legislation. I was able to bring my 20 years of business experience to this legislation. I was able to partner with Republican Senator Bob Corker on the sections of the bill that we co-authored. The sections around systemic risk and ending too big to fail were the only parts of the bill that were truly bipartisan. And why this legislation is important to an average Virginian is really 4 reasons. One, we've ended the whole notion of any financial institution being too big to fail, and consequently we've put an absolute end to any chance of a future taxpayer bailout of a financial institution. 2, we've provided for consumers more consumer protection and more clarity on whether you're getting a home mortgage, a credit card, a student loan, and making sure that some of the hidden fees and increased interest rates that have been put in some of these instruments in the past, there's going to be a lot more transparency. 3, we've made sure that this kind of hidden part of our financial industry, where a lot of new financial instruments have been created, the so-called credit default swaps, and a series of these instruments that created the financial crisis in 2008, that these instruments are now going to be traded on exchanges like stock exchanges, so there's more transparency and we know who's on both sides of the trade. And 4, perhaps most important, we've given the financial markets, which have been rocked over the last 2 years by the level of instability created by some of the excess over leverage and some of the lack of clarity about new rules. We've given them new rules of the road that I hope will stand the test of time for the next 50 years, the same way legislation that was passed in the 1930s after the Depression provided financial stability for our capitalist system for the balance of the 20th century. I think what we've created today is at least the framework of financial rules for the 21st century.
Two things to ask. What specifically do you want to see done, sort of in layman terms that people would understand? And second is, you've talked about that there's been momentum this year to get this thing done before the election, that people felt the need that reform was necessary. Would that same momentum carry through to dealing with the home mortgage industry? So what is it you think needs to happen, and is there momentum to do it since this thing is now passed?
Well, I think it would have been totally irresponsible if almost 2 years after the American taxpayers had to bail out major Wall Street banks, if we hadn't put in place a new set of rules to make sure that the American taxpayers never had to deal with that kind of crisis again, and that we had a little more clarity on some of these financial instruments that created the crisis in the first place. I also think it was the right choice, though, not to deal with the whole question of Fannie and Freddie and the government support for the home mortgage market right now, because as we've seen, the home mortgage market is really unstable. We've not seen a return to home values that we'd like to see. But I got to tell you, I'm not sure what the full solution is, but I do know if 90% of all the loans in this country are now either being backed by Fannie, Freddie, or FHA, that's way too high a percentage. And we've got to ask basic questions such as, what is our national policy on supporting and basically providing preferences for home ownership? Number one, we've got to decide if we're going to have a policy that promotes home ownership in this country, how much of that should be involved in government support in Fannie and Freddie, or should these institutions be broken up into smaller institutions where there's more competition? Should it be simply ability to have these mortgages packaged together and then securitized and placed through private hands? I think this needs a full-fledged debate. I don't have a conclusion right now. I do know that part of my job over the next 6 months as we get ready to introduce legislation next year on this is to hear from all sides. I can tell you this much. I do think, though, at the end of the day, we don't need to have 97% of our home real estate industry supported by government-sponsored institutions. I think that's way too much government intervention, and we've got to cut back. But how we do that in an orderly fashion, in a way that doesn't disrupt an already very fragile home real estate market, is going to be the challenge of the next 12 or so months. And I do think, and this is one of the areas I know there were some of our Republican colleagues who criticized us for not including Fannie and Freddie reform in this bill. I think that I don't think they had come forward with a fully thought through solutions. I hope they'll partner with me and others on this issue. And I think we've got to keep the pressure on to come back and revisit this issue next year.
Senator Joe DeShiel, WDBJ.
Hey, Joe.
You spoke of the criticism on the right and the left. Do you feel like this has broad support in the middle?
I do feel like the vast majority of Americans realize that 18 months after the Wall Street meltdown, we needed new rules of the road. And what we wanted to try to do was put appropriate regulations in place, but not create a whole new bureaucracy or so limit the flow of credit, particularly to small businesses, that it's going to slow down the recovery. I think we've struck that balance. We've said, let's put in place an ability to unwind or put out of business large firms, large financial institutions, Wall Street firms that get into trouble, and let's have them go into bankruptcy and not have taxpayers bail them out. Let's make sure that we've got appropriate underwriting standards so that somebody who's buying a home can actually afford to pay off their mortgage rather than getting in over their head when they actually just signed the mortgage in the first place. Let's make sure we take some of these sophisticated financial instruments that, quite candidly, most Americans don't understand, and even some of the folks on Wall Street didn't understand, that got us into the problem in the first place, and let's bring more clarity to those instruments by having them traded on stock exchanges so that you can see how interconnected and what kind of exposure companies and banks have to these kind of instruments. And finally, let's make sure we've got some clarity to the financial markets. I think the rest of the world has been waiting on America to act. I think you're going to see the European nations and the Asian nations now follow our lead. This has got to be done in an interconnected way. And I think most Americans, while this is a pretty complex area, I think they get the sense that we've struck the right balance. I think they've been very supportive of reform. And our job is going to be to make sure now that we've given the regulators these tools, that they actually use these tools in a responsible way.